Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I am joined by Sara Gon. Sara, how are you doing?
No, I'm fine. Thank you. And you?
I am pretty good. I'm very much hoping for the rain, which looks imminent, at least in Gauteng. And I know that some of the rest of the country is probably going to be getting a little bit more than it bargained for. I see there's thunderstorm warnings for parts of the country that look a bit scary. But anyway, we are also joined from Cape Town by Mr. Michael Morris. Michael, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. Funny enough, we had some thunder last evening, but generally in Cape Town, it's just a bit of a rumble and nothing much comes with it. So,
indeed, it feels like South Africa is both metaphorically and literally on the edge of a storm.
Yes.
But yes, a lot of.
We're about to get wet.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of
yeah.
No, we won't get wet because we're running out of water.
Right, there you go. I was just about to say a lot of last week's issues, the water crisis hitting Gauteng, that seems to have become more extreme and matured over the weekend. And now we are also seeing the Transnet strike. There's a huge amount of concern about that it only seems to be getting worse. And of course, it's still not over yet. So we're definitely going to keep our eye on those stories going forward. But that's not what we have to discuss today. Today, I'm sure many of our regular listeners will not be surprised to learn that we are going to be talking about the letter from DisChem that went viral over the weekend. So apparently, I think this letter is dated for the 19th of September, and I think it ended up in the hands of Solidarity, who contacted DisChem about it, and DisChem initially said that they had withdrawn it, but then later went into the media to say they stood by it. The letter is from the CEO of DisChem, and it reads as follows. Following a recent review of the employment equity profile in our total organization and recent BBBEE verification processes, it is evident that our organization's efforts to effect transformation in terms of our employee profile remain inadequate in spite of regionals making some inroads. Remember that we are growing at a fast rate, and few appointments other than white don't cut it. It's a ratio between white and black that counts. So when there are no suitable black candidates found and a white is appointed, we need several blacks just to maintain the status quo, never mind moving forward. With effect from today, 19 September 2022, the following will take effect. A moratorium is placed on the appointment of white individuals. This includes external appointment and internal promotions. No appointments are to be made at a managerial level, senior, middle, or junior, without my direct approval as CEO, which was asked for recently for formal authorization. The achievement of set employment equity targets will be incorporated into management bonus structure, and the allocation will be issued in due course. This will form a large part of your KPAs, probably a third. This is for real. Each region has a base from which to work and a target. We are aware that the recruitment and succession activities currently in process. Senior management is to provide myself and someone else the company mentions, who's the group HR director, with an overview of these activities by the 26th of September 2022. I will then provide feedback as to which activities may proceed. With DisChem being a JSE listed company, these are harsh measures and necessary if we are to remain profitable and to avoid a potential fine of 10% of turnover, which would cripple the business. This is a real threat at this stage. Kindly address any concerns or queries to myself or the head of HR. So this is from Ivan Saltzman, who is the CEO of DisChem. Right. So what we're really seeing here is, I'm sure you all agree, the kind of logical conclusion of where our PEE legislation leads. Our former colleague and friend, Sihle Nkubese, also known as Big Daddy Liberty, said on Twitter, "I'm promoting you because you have the right skin color needed to help me avoid a fine." That's what DisChem essentially told its employees to appease racist politicians and woke political elites. This is a sick society, and some of you are desperate to normalize it. Our society has been so abused and brainwashed by the racialism of today's political elites and our history's racism. Ordinary sane people will defend DisChem type racism because they've been dribbled into thinking it's redress. Racial bean counting and quotas are racism. Sara, what do you make of this whole story? I mean, in a lot of cases, it seems to be making what is implicit explicit in a lot of the way that big corporates work.
Yeah, I think it's actually in a way a very sad letter because it's essentially acknowledging that in order to stay on the right side of the government, you have got to apply the demographics of sort of 80%, 9%, 3%, 2%, whatever the demographics may be. And that's, I mean, that is that's no way to run a business. It's no way to run a society. It's anticipating legislation that our Commissar of number crunching and demographics, Labour Minister Thulas Nxesi, the legislation he wants to put forward, the amendment to the Employment Equity Bill. And
Minister of dividing up the jobs, not creating too many more.
That's the one. And the thing about that is, I know we're fighting it tooth and nail, as are others. But the thing is that, given the fact you've started to see an increase in in the heads of corporates taking on the government and challenging them and disagreeing with them in public, this is like going a step backwards. It's almost like taking the knee. It's a sort of, it's taking the knee to the Labour Department. And instead of saying, we won't do this, we will fight this legislation because it is not good for our business. It's racially unjust. It's essentially a racist requirement. We will treat people with respect and on an equal basis. Words to that effect. No, they're not doing that. They're essentially saying, you're going to hit us like really hard if we contravene the legislation which is about to come into force but is not yet in force. We will appease you to make sure that you don't fine us with 10% of our turnover. That's why I say it's incredibly sad. I would really have loved to see another senior person in business and commerce come up and say, no.
No, I do agree with that. There's a obviously a business has to comply with the legislation, and I think there will be a lot of anger directed at DisChem that really shouldn't be directed at DisChem. It should be directed at our government's policies. But at the same time, governments don't just, businesses do have a little bit of wiggle room here and there. They could do their things. They don't have to aggressively implement something like some of these details in the letter he sent, a third of senior management's performance targets will be enforcing racial quotas. That's pretty crazy. And that seems a bit over the top. But
sorry, Nick, just as you say that, enforcing racial quotas, I thought, wow, I grew up in apartheid. I thought apartheid had gone. Right. That was my reaction to that.
And so, I just want to push back, of course, against the inevitable pushback on us. People say, look, the IRR defending whites again, or some nonsense like that. And I'm thinking of people like Eusebius McKaiser, who wrote what I thought was a really nasty, silly piece on racial quotas in defense of DisChem sitting here. Not particularly surprising, but still not. There's a lot to pick apart in that article. But Michael, there's a very simple point that people like us non-racialists are trying to get across here, and it's racial discrimination is bad. Doesn't matter who it's against, it's bad. What do you make of all this?
A few things that I think are worth mentioning. One, just Sara started off speaking about, the fact that this is the law and companies are kind of feeling obliged. And it's this chilling idea, this chilling echo that we hear, it's the law, what can we do? How often have we heard this in history? And it invariably comes a time where it's a challenge to people who feel that they are obliged to fulfill this law or to carry out this law, where they need to resist. The only option, moral, practical option left is to say, I'm not going to do it. And you read, that phrase in the letter that you read, Nicholas, where the Saltzman referred to if our ability or the scope to which we are effecting transformation. What on earth is a company in the private sector in a country like this one that's desperate for jobs, for economic growth, for investment, for tax income, for exports, for just the general economic well-being of the society? Why is it being made to actually take on this extra task, which has nothing whatever to do with business? So one does, and I agree with you, Sara, one does have a kind of sympathy with companies like this. But then to come to your point, Nicholas, your question to me was, and the risk is always that we're going to be misunderstood. It's going to be said that because we are opposing the application of equity law, it simply means that we were in favor of apartheid. We must have been. We're in favor of this kind of benefiting white people because white people are now the ones who are going to be supposedly disadvantaged. And that, of course, is simply not the point at all. Opposing racialism is in fact it's quite apart from not being opposition to change, which we acknowledge has to occur. It's a fundamental function of our wanting to see change happen, that we must remove the racialism, because we can see so clearly it's standing in the way of all the good things that we think this society is capable of. And we now have 28 years of a solid record of ANC governance and ANC policy, so much of which is founded on this idea that was first set down in 1950 in the Population Registration Act, in which they just took on holus bolus. And it's never been as controversial as it should have been. It should have been controversial all these years. It's been far too much of a kind of fringe activity among liberals and others to say there's a problem here. We cannot simply keep talking about South Africans as if they are divisible into these different categories. So there is that. There is a risk of our being misunderstood, but it's the far greater risk actually is that we don't continue to pursue this. And the hard thing, I think, is that it does come down to this difficult, unavoidable thing to assert the principle that that race as a marker of meaning, of collective interest, of collective guilt, is always false. It's always undignifying. It's always unjust, and it's always dangerous. And so long as we get distracted by the Zubis Makaisers of the world and so on, who keep talking about social justice or racial justice or correcting the past and so on, we all believe in those things in varying degrees and by various means. But fundamental to our position is that the principle must be that we do not regard people as being worth what they look like. It's really as simple as that.
And this is a point that we've made for 90 plus years, which is that racial discrimination doesn't just hurt the people it discriminates against, it hurts everyone. It hurts the whole society from top to bottom. It reduces economic opportunities. It discriminates directly against people, previously during apartheid, against Black, Indian, and colored South Africans, and now against white South Africans, at least in this case. It cuts economic opportunity, makes everyone poorer off, it damages social relations, race relations, and it just generally makes the country worse for everyone. The only people who benefit are small politically collected elites, in both cases, in many ways. And this is the fundamental principle. It is wrong on a moral level, and it is wrong on a practical level, in that this is not going to help one Black person in the country. Well, maybe one or two here and there, but it's not going to help Black people as a whole, because it means instead of providing a service and growing their business, they're going to spend all their time running around trying to fix, make sure that everyone is the correct shade of melanin. Sara, exasperating and inevitable with our current legislation, and we'll see only more of this coming down the pipeline when as further legislation is passed. Any final thoughts on this?
I think it's just, I think I'd like to reiterate my comment earlier and refer to Moonchild's comment about all Germans would be categorized as Nazis. That's exactly the thing. I mean, if you continue, sorry, let me put it this way. Young Germans post that era, they may be very aware of their history, but they haven't been penalized for it. They are not penalized now. They've built a very successful society. I think to do so, what is happening is a form of revenge. It's in a way, it's kind of funny because it's this huge majority theoretically benefiting off the back of a increasingly smaller minority, and it's more akin, you put pieces of legislation in and someone says, you're meeting quotas. Wow. I've read a lot of history around the Holocaust and the Nazi era, and this is it. And people say, "Oh, no, could it never be because this is a democratic government." The only way to deal with this and get some perspective on these issues is to understand some history.
Right. Is that this stuff never works? It's zero sum thinking never works.
It's exactly zero sum. Sorry.
And there's also that peculiar thing that's implicit, although I don't know if I've ever seen it stated explicitly, but the kind of assumption that everything that's wrong in the country has been deliberately created by the minority, the white minority, and actually that it benefits them. It's this peculiar kind of assumption that that racism, that a deliberate kind of racist set of choices has led to, unemployment and economic decline and depredation.
And as you said earlier, it's actually the opposite.
Right, exactly. Black unemployment does nothing to assist me in my life at all. In fact, it literally makes it just worse.
It does.
All right. Two final things. One is that I'm just grumpy at DisChem anyway because they messed up a whole bunch of stuff when I ordered things from them. So I was already
now you've really got
customer of them. But the second thing is we do have a campaign around this, of course, and you can check that out if you want to help us push back against racist laws, racialism, and see South Africa become the non-racial place that it really should and could be. So the link to that will be in the comments on YouTube and also in the live chat here. I've put a link to it. Okay, so enough about that. Let's move overseas to interesting developments going around the world, particularly with regards to China. So we didn't get time to cover this story last week, but there was a vote on the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council, as far as I'm concerned, is a fairly notorious organization for how it tends to be stacked with many members who are, shall we say, not huge fans of human rights themselves. The UN released a report about the treatment of the Uyghur minority and Muslims in general in China's Xinjiang province. And they found that there were some serious problems. Now, firstly, the release of this report was a bit weird because I think it was the Human Rights Commissioner,
yeah.
Yes.
Commissioner of Human Rights, yeah.
Released this report critical of China and its treatment of Uyghur Muslims literally minutes before her term ended and she resigned. So clearly she was a bit worried about releasing this thing while she still held the office at all. But nonetheless, this has now gone before the Human Rights Council of the UN, and there was a question of whether it should be discussed. Not voted on, not decided what's going to be done about it, anything like that. Literally just talked about. And the Human Rights Council of the UN, by 19 votes against 17, voted that discussing it was pointless. The countries which voted against it were Bolivia, China, Cameroon, Cuba, Eritrea, Gabon, Indonesia, Ivory Coast, Kazakhstan, Mauritania, Namibia, Nepal, Pakistan, Qatar, Senegal, Sudan, the UAE, Uzbekistan, and Venezuela. Which is pretty rough stuff, I think, that the UN, as one person put it in the reporting of this, the UN said there's human rights abuses, and then the UN says, okay, but we also can't talk about those human rights abuses. So, Sara, I know this really annoys you for many reasons, but your thoughts on this particular one?
Yeah. What's kind of funny is I mean, look, I don't find it terribly surprising. It is unusual for the actual the document not even to be put on the table for discussion, let alone be acted upon. But okay, that's the swing that China has. But virtually every single one of the countries that supported it, I've got more human rights in my pinky than they have collectively. I mean, they are really, human rights abusers to a greater or lesser extent. So we know where they stand. They're all out there. So is China. The interesting thing, of course, is that sort of half the countries are African, half are Muslim, and somewhere in between they're a combination of left-wing governments. There are no Western countries to be seen in that list. So look, I think the tragedy is it does indicate the might of the Chinese, and I think there should be some pause for thought for them, because Russia actually got thrown off the Human Rights Council for its invasion of Ukraine, which, I mean, I have to be honest, I was amazed by. I thought there'd be enough, sorry, to quote Donald Trump, shithole countries supporting Russia to avoid that, but it didn't happen, not by a long shot. It was a substantial majority. But I think the bottom line is this: if a report on oppression, and if you read some of the points about the oppression, it's straight out of the Gulag or the concentration camps.
Right.
I mean,
this
it's
is horrible
that sort of
stuff.
stuff. Yeah,
Rape,
absolutely horrible stuff.
executions, forcible sterilizations on a mass scale. It's really horrifying stories.
It's terrible. It's really terrible stuff. And I think my only real comment is to support the Wall Street Journal's editorial on it, and that from America's point of view, they should stop giving it money. Preferably have it shut down if that were humanly possible. But if America stopped giving it money, it would suddenly find itself in a great deal of difficulty, and that couldn't be a better thing to happen to the Human Rights Council, so-called.
So I almost entirely agree with you, Sara, except I think that there are a couple of countries in here that voted against that I'm a little bit surprised by. And among those are Indonesia, Senegal, and Nepal. So Nepal, I think, is just straight up scared of China because they bordered them.
Mm.
Indonesia is an interesting one. Indonesia is a very complicated country, and it's something I know a little bit about because I've been there a couple of times. It's sort of kind of democratic, but also kind of not. It's got a sort of free-ish market and system and things like that, but also sort of not. It's very Islamic, but not quite as Islamic as, say, a place like Pakistan. And you can kind of see this represented and how I think that China has just straight up managed to intimidate them in the comments of the Indonesian ambassador with regards to how his country voted, saying, as the world's largest Muslim country and a vibrant democracy, we cannot close our eyes to the plight of our Muslim brothers and sisters. But as China did not consent to discussion, will not yield meaningful progress. Hence, we voted no.
In fact, I'm going to give that advice to Israel. If they withhold their consent, they can't pass resolution.
Yeah, it's all just a bit silly, and I really think there's some interesting examples here of how China really has been able to play games in the UN very effectively to crush opposing voices. Michael, what do you make of that?
I certainly agree. I mean, it's it's China's muscle writ large in a way. And I was looking at an Amnesty International piece on the vote, which concludes that its own Free Xinjiang detainees campaign has to date profiled 126 individuals who are among the perhaps 1 million or more people in arbitrary detention in internment camps and prisons. I mean, that is just the scale of it is just astonishing. And yet it does demonstrate that when it comes to playing international politics in that demure sort of grand style of the UN, with all its offices and its protocols and its budgets and so on, that 1 million people imprisoned and the torturing going on and so on takes second place to the big game of global politics. And
right. If we were to list the number of times that the UN has been caught napping at the wheel, not least, of course, in Africa, Rwanda, the genocide there, we'd have a whole podcast full of just that. But not a great look.
Yeah. So maybe Sara's point is a good one. You cut their budget. It concentrates the mind of these.
Well, I would hope so. Or maybe then China would just take the opportunity to fill in that budget and take even more.
Maybe that probably would. Yeah.
So, kind of vaguely related to this is that the 20th Party Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, is taking place in China at the moment, with delegates from across the country. And this is in many ways the most important political event in China because it's not, it has no sort of democratic system at all. And as a result, whoever the party chooses as its leader controls the country. Now, Xi Jinping, who's the current president of China, has been criticized by some people even within the CCP, or at least, shall we say, former people within the CCP who have mostly fled the country, for centralizing power in his own office rather than doing it by a kind of committee operation, which is how China was run, particularly after Mao and Deng Xiaoping's times past. And Xi Jinping has, brought China, it seems, once again back to himself. He's removed term limits for himself as president of China. He's essentially established a cult of personality in himself, and he's done a whole bunch of kind of controversial things. One of them was, of course, the detention of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, but also the crushing of Hong Kong's independence and China's zero COVID policy, which continues to be brutally enforced across the country. There is like some stories about how an infant can be tested for COVID in China something like 15 times in their first year of life, which is crazy. Sara, what do you make of this? Do you think there's the expectation from the outside world is that Xi Jinping will sail once again to total dominance of the Chinese Communist Party? But I don't know. Do you think there's any opportunity there'll be a revolt inside the Communist Party against it?
I don't think so. I'm not sure that. I think there won't be a revolt. Whether the sentiment, however, is one of complete acquiescence, I suspect not. I mean, from the Chinese population's point of view, the lockdowns have been very brutal, and he's very much, he's the driving force behind those, ordering those lockdowns, and it was almost like our first story. It was a moment for the broader Communist Party worthies to not vote him in for his third term, to create something of a schism, because he regards the crushing of Hong Kong as a real good. I mean, that has been good for China. It was a good thing to do. And obviously, from a democratic point of view, it was an absolute disaster. So he's a man, and it comes from a very sort of rigid background, unpleasant childhood by all accounts. And I think he is really your absolute autocrat. And the Communist Party has allowed itself to allow him to take that position. I think the problem with taking that position, particularly in the face of not so wonderful economic circumstances and much lower growth in China than it's used to, is if enough tensions arise, something may be sparked. But I wouldn't hold up hope. There hasn't been a revolution of any kind in China since 1949, not in the really impressive sense. The move to capitalism, to some extent, was a revolution, but I think it's a society that's got used to being very much ruled from the top in a very strong manner, to a greater or lesser extent over the years. And so he embodies it, and you can see the whole presentation of the Congress, the huge red curtains, the symbols. I mean, I saw a picture of him riding a car in a parade. I don't know if it's recent or past, but first of all, the car looked like it was made in 1975, and secondly, it had lots of microphones so that he could be standing out. He was standing up and he could speak into these microphones to the awaiting masses. I mean, that's stuff out of the 50s. I mean, it's pure, that's really the bad old days. And I think I'm not sure in the long run he'll be good for China. I think it might be a mistake, but I'm not an expert enough.
I very much agree with that. Everything I've read on China suggests that he's in some ways at least bringing the country back towards its Maoist period. And the secret to China's success has been that it's maintained the CCP has maintained its grip on power, but at the same time, it's actually allowed some private enterprise to flourish. And Xi Jinping, at the moment at least, looks very much like he may be reversing that. And I think that the Chinese are going to regret, or at least the Communist Party itself, for its own sake, is going to regret keeping him in power. It seems like the anti-Xi Jinping faction did not manage to get anything together. Michael, what do you make of all this before we close up today?
Yeah, I certainly agree with all those sentiments. It's funny, I mean, just this morning in Business Day, my fortnightly column, I dwelt on on why I think the West is not in decline. And part of the kind of reason, one of the points that I sort of drew on or elaborated on was that it's precisely in authoritarian regimes where one doesn't find the freedom and dynamism and difficulty and argumentativeness that is characteristic of the West, and which is actually the West's strength. And I remain convinced that what we see happening in China, where there was this sort of period liberalizing and kind of free market economics and so on, which self-evidently brought benefits to lots and lots of people, millions of people. It also, because of the nature of the Chinese authoritarianism, it brought vulnerability and a risk, and communists, cannot tolerate such they quite certainly can't survive those kinds of liberalizing processes. And it seems my Scottish dog entirely agrees with these sentiments too.
Definitely. All right, that is all the time we have for today. We hope that you found the show interesting, and we will be back tomorrow, of course, on the Daily Friend Show. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Cheers, everyone.